It seems in Europe, in the United Kingdom and Germany, they're thinking of fighting Russia. And they were talking about how we can lose to Russia when our economy is larger than Russia's economy. When I see their GDP at PPP,
Right.
you see the best country in Europe was Germany. That this war, this conflict in Ukraine devastated the Germans' economy. And Russia is doing better than all of the European countries right now. When they're talking about fighting Russia, what's their goal, in your opinion?
Well, first, thanks for having me back on. And for folks who aren't familiar with what Nima is talking about, there are uh, two major definitions of gross domestic product. One, GDP nominal, where everything is based against just flat out how much is the country's output, which has all types of issues with that because things that are you would consider negative are considered output. So here, if you have a a company go bankrupt, the money that law firms are paid to handle bankruptcies is considered part of output, just as an example of how everything is thrown in there, even things that are considered negative. So it definitely benefits a service-based economy as opposed to a manufacturing economy. But PPP, purchasing power parity, is the other form of measuring, a country's output, economic size, and that's done by comparing against a basket, so to speak, so that everyone is put on an equal footing. So that but when you do that, and if people have not done this, go and look up and the whether it's from the World Bank or whoever, their listings of nominal GDP and then by purchasing power parity GDP PP, and you'll see a massive difference in how the nations are ranked. And one of those, as Nemo was saying, is that you see that with Russia, and you'll see that with Russia with PPP. It is, I think, fifth or sixth on the list overall nationwide, and on the nominal list, it's probably about 13th or 14th. I think it's pretty far down. And it's nations that have historical merit, if you will, like the United Kingdom, still rank as number 5 or so on the nominal list. A big deal because India just overtook that. But when you look at the PPP list and see where the United Kingdom ranks against China, against India, against Russia, you see, wow, holy cow, this makes sense, because just how big is the United Kingdom? How could they be? How could they have much larger economies than these nations like India or Russia, or just not be so far behind China? But with PPP, you see that you see I think a more accurate measurement of these economies. So I want to, but the point about what the Germans have endured these last 2 years, because the invasion of the Russian invasion is coming up, in a few weeks. You've seen a nation that was vulnerable to the dangers of taking such an adversarial stance against Russia. That its economy was dependent on importing energy. Its trading partners, its relationships, but then also too the way that the Germans and many other European nations have not prioritized their weapons industries the way the Americans have. And that's why they don't have, to a degree, hollowed out industries. But also this shows too, though, the overall fabric and framework of Western economies, of Western markets, that they are very fragile. So that if you do something like you're seeing in Europe, where the shift is occurring from, we are now going to prioritize weapon making, we are going to put billions of dollars into building artillery shell factories, we are going to let our weapons companies have these just obscene terms that they can operate under, and we're just gonna back them to the hilt with everything at the expense of our economy, at the expense of our infrastructure, at the expense of our people, which is what, again, has happened in the United States. And you're starting to see that type of degradation of European economies, but especially German. And it's due to a mania. There is a desire this is a emotional leadership. And just in the last couple of weeks, I've seen articles. You reference this, Nima. I've seen articles where interviews have been done by the German defense minister, by the German chief of staff of their military, and the way they speak, the language they use, how they talk about like this inevitability of war with Russia. And of course, we've seen that from the Brits for quite a while, because the Brits are probably the most hawkish on all this. But we've seen this also coming from other quarters of Western European capitals, this desire to have this defining war, to have this type of adversary, to have this type of enemy, because this is what gives us meaning. This is what gives us purpose. And if our economy is going to slide backwards, if our infrastructure is going to crumble, if we're not going to take care of our people the way they've been taken care of, particularly in Western Europe since the end of World War II, well, then we're going to use this adversary to distract them, right? And so what you have is you have this culmination where all these different interests, all these different elites, if you will, find a common cause, find value in a war with Russia. And many of them, I think they can manage it and just go up to the line of war, or just, Ukraine will be the war. We won't get directly involved. We're just going to push it right up to the line. And we'll reap all the benefits, though, of having this enemy, of having a war that defines us, that gives us meaning. In the words of the great Chris Hedges, war is a force that gives us meaning. And that's what you're seeing here. This is very this is very primordial. This is how the human species has always worked, unfortunately, particularly since the advent of nation states. Prior to that, it may have been different, but essentially since nation states and ethno identities and nationalism and those sorts of things have become integral part of who we are and how we operate as a species, warfare has come to be a useful tool for those states. And then certainly the danger of this that you were alluding to is quite great, because the recklessness of it. It's not just the danger of a war with Russia, which would be catastrophic, but also too what's going to be done to your economies. You've already seen the destruction that's occurred to your economies because of this war. Your foolish and unwise and stupid decisions over these last couple of years to back this unwinnable war with Russia, a nation that, to your other point, prepared for this war. And I think that's the reason why you've seen the success of the Russian economy, because they prepared for it. The Russians, in many ways, I believe, or I shouldn't say all the Russians, parts of or elements of Russian leadership wanted this war. Elements of Russian society, media, the political establishment, what have you, wanted this war, and they prepared for it, and they knew that the sanctions were going to come. And then the other, and so as well as they knew what their requirements were going to be. So the way they construct their munitions factories and their weapons factories and the way their tank and armored vehicle factories are set up to have a surge capacity. You don't see that anywhere in the West. They were prepared for this war. And then the third aspect of all this, of course, is the timeliness of it. The how fed up most of the world is with the United States and with its supplicant European allies, how fed up they are. And so this war occurs at a time when people really just needed one little push to make breaks with the United States and the United States' hegemony. Already they were suffering on it. They saw it was dangerous. It's only a matter of time until we are directly impacted the way all these other nations are impacted. We're sick of that. All the Americans will offer us our bases and drones and commandos and monies for military, and that's it. They order us to do things. We're sick of it. And so I think that's why you saw this willingness not to go along with the United States and the West in the Ukrainian war. And if not to side with Russia, well, then to continue to trade with Russia, and most especially, of course, China. But you've seen that with India and Turkey, and in Iran, of course, the nation that we've pushed together with Russia. The idea that I've read something recently, the idea of this of a Moscow-Tehran defense pact is not, it may happen. And, so I think if you were to wake up the ghosts of Zbigniew Brzezinski's and others and say, hey, look what we did. Look what we accomplished. We pushed Moscow and Tehran together, they would go back to the grave. They wouldn't believe it, that this is what we've accomplished. So much of this is a reality of our own making. And whether it's the Americans, the Brits, the Germans, whoever, it's a reality of their making.
Man, you said probably Russia wanted this war. Part of Russia wanted this war. We know that during Minsk I and Minsk II, then later Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, they said that these agreements were a sham. They were preparing Ukraine to fight Russia. We know that Russians have a lot of intelligence coming from Ukraine. That can happen during that agreements. They knew it's gonna come to them. That's why they were well prepared for this conflict.
Yeah, there certainly was. I believe there was, again, in elements of not all of Russia, and certainly you saw the Russians attempt diplomatic, overtures, made diplomatic efforts. Minsk I and Minsk II, the whole excuse me, the whole Normandy process. That was, the Russians are fully involved in that. And the same as with attempts at the end of 2021 to talk to the Americans. The Russians put forth a draft peace plan, basically. And then, of course, the diplomatic efforts at the beginning of the war in February or March, early April, the peace talks that were occurring in Belarus and then Turkey, and one after another, we keep getting more evidence of what actually occurred there. And it's very clear that the Ukrainians were willing to enter into a deal with the Russians. The Russians were willing to enter into a deal with the Ukrainians, and the West, the Americans and the British in particular, pulled the Ukrainians out of that peace deal in April of 2022. And so the Russians certainly were interested in diplomatic efforts to deal with this, to solve this. And there were many in the West who were not. And as you said, Holland and Merkel flat out about a year ago came out and said, the Minsk process was only meant to give us time to build up the Ukrainian military to prepare for war, which it's very similar to basically what Chamberlain did in Munich with Nazi Germany, the idea to give Britain time to build up in order to fight them later. Something that, real disservice, I think, to Chamberlain, the way he's been maligned for decades. But that seems to have been the strategy, because at that point, the Brits wouldn't have been able to fight the Germans. They needed a couple of years to prepare themselves. And I think that was the thinking going into how the West and the Ukrainian government was handling Minsk II, is that we're going to, at best, slow roll this. And in reality, in many ways, completely obfuscate it, completely corrupt it, completely just not go along with it, do everything we can to just, again, at best, draw it out. And in many other ways, just ignore it, not comply with it. So certainly the Russians pushed forward with diplomacy, but there also was, I believe, within certain, particularly the farther right you go, and if people are familiar with the Russian political setup, in terms of, the most pressure that Vladimir Putin is under comes from his right, comes from those who, in the case of Ukraine, are saying, you're not fighting hard enough, you're not doing enough. Why is Kiev and Odessa, and why are their buildings still standing? How come you haven't made Lviv look like Khan Yunis or Gaza City? That's basically what the most political pressure on Putin has been coming from. So there certainly was those in Russia who wanted this war, who saw this as, this is our chance to stand up to the Americans, to the West. This is our chance to protect our people. This is our chance to reestablish some form of pride, all kinds of different factors into their thinking. But ultimately we are here now, almost again, a month away from the 2-year anniversary of Russia's invasion. And looking back, you can clearly see how Russia prepared for this, not just militarily, but economically, in the sense that their economy has done incredibly well in spite of all the sanctions, in spite of what should be a very draining war. But I think that will have a factor over time, Nima. I mean, the Russians are spending about a third of their public expenditures right now on the war in Ukraine. That's going to have an effect. You can get away with that for a year or two or three, but at some point, that's going to catch up with you. And you're going to have to start making difficult choices. People are start going to, whether you're going to have some type of issues you aren't fulfilling, you have to make cutbacks to the services you're providing your people. Pensions aren't going to be, adjusted as people would like, possibly. I mean, those typical tough choices, as well as the fact that, right now the Russians have this great big sovereign wealth fund that has come from their mainly from their oil and gas industry, and hundreds of billions of dollars in that. And they've taken some out of that, but not more than 15% or so, I think, at this point. But that is going to continue to wear down, as this war proceeds. So while I would say that the Russians are in a good spot right now, where they could get, negotiations would have to be under their terms. I also don't think that they can advance past the river, that they are stuck in this form of stalemate, and that time ultimately is against them, because of the cost of this war, as well as the fact that, at some point the casualties are going to have a political impact. All foreign wars do that. There's going to be a political cost to all those casualties. And so, at that point, when those things start to hit the Russians in 2 or 3 years, say, maybe, that's when ostensibly the Americans and the Europeans, particularly the Americans, though, are going to have their munitions factories up and running. And the United States will be producing 4 million 155 millimeter rounds a year. We'll be producing 500 Patriot interceptor missiles a month. Whatever needs to be done, we will be doing that. It's just a question of putting the money and have the time for the defense industry in the U.S. to build these things. So that's just what they're waiting on, is the money. You would think that and I think that is a thing people should recognize as well about the American defense industry. How come they don't have a surge capability? Isn't their purpose national security? When you go to war, don't you surge forces? Don't you bring in reserves? You have a draft. How come the defense industry has no ability to do that without receiving tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars more? It's because the American defense industry, the military industrial complex, its first and primary purpose is profits for those companies, as well as power for the Pentagon. And a secondary purpose way down the line is actually being able to fight and win wars.
When you talk about the conflict between NATO and Russia, do you find it as a war of attrition, or it can get nuclear?
I think both is the case. And because it's a war of attrition, because it's stalemated in the way that I see it, where neither side can have a strategic advance that defeats the other side. So if you're going to have tactical successes and you're going to have operational successes, but you don't have the wherewithal on either side to have any type of breakout, if you will, where you cause the enemy to collapse, where you take the enemy's capital, whatever your metric for victory is. Now, it's possible that one side of it could collapse unforeseen. And I think most people would say, if I was going to put my money anywhere on which is going to collapse, it's going to be Ukraine, because Ukraine is a bubble. It is a house of cards. If American and Western money does not keep coming, it's not just that the military will collapse, but the Ukrainian economy will collapse. The Ukrainian government will stop functioning. It won't have money to pay its people. It won't have the resources it needs to operate a society, basically. And so this is why it is a house of cards. Excuse me. And so you have that very real danger. You also have issues in Ukraine about munition shortages, and as well as manpower shortages. And so those are very real factors, which have been exacerbated by the stupidity of the Ukrainian general staff and the Ukrainian leadership and American leadership and British leadership and NATO leadership in pushing operations in 2023 that were just absolutely catastrophic for the Ukrainian military, whether it was the defense of Bakhmut or that offensive, the summer of 2023 offensive. Those were completely the degradation of the Ukrainian military that occurred because of that, the loss of men and equipment and munitions for nothing. And it was all geared as a public relations offensive. So the defense of Bakhmut was done primarily to show that we're not going to give in to the Russians. This is going to be heroic. This is going to be our Alamo, if you will, and the offensive in 2023 was meant to show that Ukraine's a good bet. Look, we're going to beat the Russians. You need to continue to send us M1 tanks and F-16s and continue to send us tens and tens of billions of dollars to keep our economy running and to, pay our troops and everything else. And that was the purpose of it. I think there were many in the United States and in the UK who believed the Ukrainians would win, but these are the same men and women who unfortunately are in power, also are in positions of or proximity to power in the think tanks and in the media throughout the US and the UK, who also think that the US is going to win in the Red Sea against the Yemenis, who thought the US was going to win in Afghanistan when we surged, who thought that the Americans were going to, like that, all that type of magical thinking, like go back 10 years, these are the same people who are just, saying, oh, it's a matter of days until Bashar Assad falls, like that type of thing. Oh, no, and we're not aligned with Al-Qaeda and these other reactionary extreme religious groups. We're with the moderate. I mean, these are the types of people who live in a fantasy world. But for whatever reason, they have PhDs, they're former colonels or generals, they're well paid by the defense industry, and they've got the clout to be the ones who represent the thinking behind the American empire and push that thinking. But, the idea of it going nuclear, Nima, is a very real possibility. So if you were to have a couple of scenarios, I think you were to have a collapse of the Ukrainian line and the Russians were to advance through it rapidly towards Kyiv, would you have the danger then is that the Romanians and the Poles feel that they have to move into Kyiv in order to protect Western Ukraine, right? To create a buffer against the Russians as well as to take what they want as well. That's a long history that I'm sure many people are familiar with. But the other thing would be, will you have Americans or Brits who you've seen their decision making, and you've seen how, whether it be with Ukraine, you see with what's happening with these are people who are willing to call what the Israelis are doing in Gaza self-defense and not a genocide. So why would they not think about using a small nuclear weapon? So the smallest nuclear weapon in the American inventory is 0.3 kilotons, which is the Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons. So you get an idea of just what order of magnitude difference it is from the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And the Hiroshima bomb, by all measures, is considered a tactical sized weapon. And you hear that term a lot, tactical nuclear weapons. Well, the size of the Hiroshima bomb at 15 kilotons, well, that would be a tactical nuclear weapon today. So this, could you get, particularly if you had a Trump presidency, someone who's as malleable as Donald Trump, someone who's as foolish and as unworldly, could you get him to go along with using this very small nuclear weapon that doesn't even really should count as a nuclear weapon because it's so small? If you had someone like him, or even if you had Joe, I mean, you could see it being done with Joe Biden, because these are the people who, again, are saying what the Israelis are doing is self-defense, not genocide. So just mumble the words around, become very, just take an Orwellian twist to this. And it's not a tactical nuclear weapon. It's enhanced conventional explosive or something like that, right? Just like this wasn't torture, it was enhanced interrogation. And could you see that then being used, maybe not against Russian forces, but as a warning to Russian forces? And then, of course, you've now gone up several rungs on the escalation ladder, because rather than, as remind everyone, the escalation ladder is just that. You can either go up or down. There's no side to side. And so if you were to do that, where does that go? You also have this very real danger that the war is stalemated. Neither side's advancing. Neither side can advance. I don't think the Russians want to advance past the river anyway, because then they would be they'd have to occupy large parts of Ukraine that are not Russian speaking, where they would not be welcomed, that hadn't been, a large part of where they are now have been in warfare for 10 years now. So, many of the people had left already, or they were accustomed to the war, if I can use that kind of language for it. So they would be advancing into a part of Ukraine where it would be very difficult for them, where it would make what the Americans went through in Iraq look very similar to the Russians. So, you know, what you then have though is, well, how do you prove to your people? How do you demonstrate that you're winning? How do you demonstrate that you're fighting, that you're giving them as good as you're getting? And you do that by bombing their cities. And this is what occurs in the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, is you have a war of cities, as it's called, because that war is stalemated. Neither side can really advance. Don't you take villages, you cross this stream, those are all tactical or at best operational victories. They're not strategic. And so I think when you talk about stalemated, you got to understand, I think what you want to look at what level you're talking here. Cause I know this stalemate question is a big, people get wrapped around it, but the, danger then is that what happens in the Iran-Iraq war, the 80s, is that they start attacking each other's cities, and you have what's called the War of Cities, and it becomes really tit for tat. And where does that go? So you have the danger of this horizontal, you have dangers of both horizontal and vertical escalations, where again you could see other nations come into this. You could see the introduction of an increased attack on cities. You could see the introduction of a nuclear weapon. So just the fact that it's in a stalemated front line and the possibilities that that front line could become frozen, I think the more likelihood is, because we keep seeing more and more of this, and I think we've spoken about this before, the danger of the front line becoming a true no man's land, where it's just completely dominated by drones, and then I think you could see that possibly in 6 months' time. Autonomous drones that are shielded from electromagnetic warfare, dominating and controlling the entire front line, where no one can go because the drones will kill you. And then of course there'll be drones that attack those drones. You have fighter drones and all those type of things. But that's what the front line, I believe, could look like within 6 months' time. I mean, and people have been saying this for quite a while. I think we've talked about it. So, the dangers of where all this could go are really striking, and the catastrophe that could come from this is and unfortunately, not that they would be making the right decisions anyway, or correct decisions or competent decisions, but American leadership is not focused on this right now. It's focused on what's happening, rightly, with the genocide in Gaza. But you definitely, this is not something that can't be attended to. It needs to be resolved.
Recently, I read an article of Professor Nikolai Petrov. He wrote this article about the war in Ukraine, and the title is "To End the War in Ukraine, Expose Its Core Lie." And in his vision, the core lie is Russia wanted to subsume all of Ukraine, and after that, march toward Europe. In your opinion, did the Europeans buy this kind of rhetorics, or they decided to go along with Washington's foreign policy no matter what it is?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a good simulation of the core lie of all this, which is similar to all the other lies of war. Basically it comes back to this trope that exists in American politics and among American media. We don't fight them over there, we'll have to fight them here. It's the same thing that was being used for the Iraqis, for the Afghans, for the Syrians, for the Vietnamese. If we let the Vietnamese win, then they're going to take all of Asia, and then they're going to take, they'll sweep down, take Australia and New Zealand. I mean, like, this, the nonsense of it, looking back, is just, revolting and so ludicrous. But that's what, if you looked at the New York Times or the Washington Post or Time Magazine during that time, that's what they were saying. That's what they believed. There's these great, there's a great series of graphics from Time Magazine in 1941 or maybe early 1942 about how the Nazis were going to invade the United States. and had these maps and showed them going first down into South America and then just advancing up South America through Central America and taking the United States that way, launching a massive naval fleet and taking the East. I mean, like just, complete nonsense, just fantasy stuff. But that, Time Magazine at that point, the most important magazine in the world, basically, if not the United States, if not just the United States, printed it as very serious stuff. And I think you have a mindset that is what goes back to what we were saying earlier about the Europeans and their desire to jump into this war. They see benefits to themselves. They see, those who are in power in Europe, those who want to be in power in Europe, they see more of a benefit for their own interests, and whether that be individual or institutional, in going along with this war, going along with the world superpower, the United States, though that description is steadily being eroded. Going than being on the outside. They've seen how this works before, that if they don't go along with this war, then they will be labeled as weak. They will be labeled as apologists for a foreign government. They will be criticized for not being compassionate and caring about the suffering of others. They will be considered as being scared to fight, right? All these things that politicians are deathly afraid of. The media likes a story. It's a simple good versus evil narrative, very Manichaean. It's very us versus them, right? The Russians are, depending on who you ask, whether they're European or not. But if you were to ask most of those who are so set against Russia particularly in Europe, are the Russians European? They will say no, they're not, right? So, and that's been a thing with Russia for centuries, right? Whether they're considered European or not by the other Europeans, or whether they're simply these barbarians or Asiatics or whatever, however they were described, who are across the border, right? So it plays into those century-long idea of who the Russians are and why we have to stand up to them. I mean, for the British, this is certainly what they have utilized for centuries. I mean, you go back and you look at the British politics of the 19th century, and their political parties were, who is tougher on Russia? Who's going to stand up to Russia more? I mean, this is something goes back 200 years in Britain. So it was very, very effective, very tried and true. So it was easy for people to grasp on. The media, again, this fits for them. This sells copy for them. It gets viewers, it gets clicks for them. And then you have the whole aspects of the other organizations, the other institutions, the militaries, the defense industries, the banks, the fossil fuel companies. This is the big thing, of course, with, if you start to measure winners and losers, and we have a preponderance of things to say, well, the Russians are kind of winning here. The big victory so far, the only clear-cut victory that I see is for the American oil and gas companies. The United States is now the largest exporter of liquid natural gas. We now are the largest exporter of liquid natural gas to the European market, which is what this really comes back to for me. There's certainly megalomania involved, ideology involved, all the history I just spoke about. But one of the other factors so key is who gets to dominate the European gas market. And now the Americans do. So if you were to make a list of who's winning, who's losing, at this point, I have to think about it, but the only solid W right now is for the Americans and getting the liquid natural gas market. I mean? So there are all those factors that made it more likely for people to go along with this great lie. Because you have to give people a reason why. Okay, if it's just something that's been going on in Ukraine for all this time and it's really pretty limited, and the Russians are not going to advance past where the Russian speakers are, and there's all this history of coup in 2014 and all this civil war and diplomatic attempts that have just been refused by the West. Why are we fighting this? Well, it's because they want to conquer us. We have to stand up to them, right? And so, yeah, you could see how that lie makes selling the war a lot easier. It makes it gives an excuse for people to go along with it, even when they know it's not probably the right thing or the best thing or a reasonable thing. Yeah, I mean, so it's a lie that's so easily destroyed, right, on the face of evidence. I mean, anyone watching this, war over these last couple of years, what makes you think the Russians could advance? They can't even advance. They controlled 10% of Ukraine before February 24th, 2022. They now control about 18%. So they've taken 8% of Ukrainian, and a lot of that 8% they kind of already controlled anyway because of the preceding 8 years of civil war and unrest and separatism and et cetera in the Donbass. And so what makes people think the Russians would be able to do anything? I mean, I say that I think they would go up the Dnieper River, but I don't even know if they can make it that far. Do they have the wherewithal to do that? As well as how difficult modern warfare is, particularly with the drones. You put stuff out in the open on roads, it's going to get destroyed. And that will in time be, things are constantly evolving. So that will in time, of course, be countered. But right now, but also, this idea is so ludicrous and this lie is so bold, but it's an effective lie.
It's so tragic to see Green Party doing this to Germany, because I thought that this party was hope for the future.
Right.
This political party, AfD, Alternative for Germany, for Deutschland. The leader of this party just start talking about Dexit. It's Brexit and Dexit. Do you find it serious, or do you find it some sort of reflection of this conflict in Ukraine?
I think the war in Ukraine bolsters a lot of the talking points behind those nationalists, right? And that's ultimately what these types of exits are about. Getting our integrity back, preserving, our body, right? Who we are, preserving ourselves as a people. We have to untangle ourselves from others. And I mean, that's I think these exit campaigns, that's the core. That's what they're this identity is what they are trying to grasp people with, right? Like, aren't you tired of those people, right, taking your jobs? Aren't you tired of paying taxes so those people don't have to work? As well as, aren't you tired of paying all these high expensive prices for everything because those people in Brussels tell us we have to have, these regulations and these taxes and everything else. So it's effective. It's serious. It worked in Britain. I don't know, Germany. How much do they believe it? The leadership of that party, I don't really know. I think in Britain, there were some who certainly believed it, but among others who were part of that campaign, which is a pretty big and wide campaign, they saw opportunity. And I think, as you brought up the Greens in Germany, you can see how a party could begin with principles. People within the party believe those principles, and then just drop those principles because it's politically convenient. And I think that's something we have to understand about many Western politicians, is that the means are the ends for them, is that the assumption of power, the position of power, that's the end. It's not about accomplishing anything. It's about being the foreign minister of Germany. It's about being the Secretary of State of the United States. There's nothing else other than that. So accomplishing some type of platform, seeing policies implemented, improving the lives for a constituency, accomplishing some, like in the Green sense, in the Green Party sense, accomplishing some type of eco-socialist vision for a new world, right? That's not their interest, these people. It's the power. It's being in control, So again, the end, the means are the ends. I think you see that that's different. We often associate that with dictators, but I would say even for people like Benjamin Netanyahu, I wouldn't say that completely applies. Certainly anyone who's observed Netanyahu knows his political survival is paramount to him, and he has demonstrated that many times throughout the decades. He's a master at political survival, but he also, I think, has a purpose that drives him. And I think Netanyahu does believe his political survival and everything else is paramount, but he also does believe in the greater Israel project. He believes in doing his part to fulfill the Zionist ambition. Like, so he has a vision where if you look at a Tony Blinken or a Joe Biden, that's not there. There is no vision for what they want. They just want power. And I would say that's the case for politicians in the United Kingdom and politicians throughout Western Europe. And, this idea that this position I'm sitting in, this chair I am, this is the ends. This is it. And whatever I have to do to maintain that, I will. So whoever I have to placate, whoever I have to abandon, so be it, because this chair I'm sitting in is the ends I've been seeking. As opposed to, again, some type of change they want to bring in, or improvement, or policy or whatnot.
It seems that the Netanyahu administration decided to slow down these operations in Gaza. What's happening right now?
Well, I think what we're seeing right now is just a shift in the operations. They've destroyed northern Gaza. I just saw a thing yesterday. There are no mosques left standing in northern Gaza, and they're moving into southern Gaza, which is where they've pushed all the people, right? Or not all the people, but most of the people, because there still are some people living in northern Gaza. God bless them and God help them. But I don't think there's been a reduction in the IDF's campaign in any sense that they have said, all right, bring it back. We're not going to kill as many people anymore. I think they may be running out of targets. They are resetting their forces. We saw how they repositioned forces, took troops out of Gaza. They are concerned about what's happening in northern Israel with Lebanon. There are many within Israel who want to see the Israelis invade Lebanon again. I saw this headline the other day, and I just couldn't believe it. About if an Israeli politician talking about reoccupying Lebanon. It's like, how bad it went for you. What a nightmare, what a 20, some odd year nightmare that was for you all. And it gave you Hezbollah and all kinds of other things. And you want to do it again. But there is that, there's that desire. I think so. What you've seen is just a shift in the operations, and it may appear as if and certainly they've been saying that they are. Sorry, some of them have been saying they've been drawing down. That means mainly seems to be coming from Western media sources, from American media sources, I feel, more than anything else. The prime minister, senior leaders, the IDF, they've been saying that they are going to carry out this war in Gaza through this year, that this will go into 2025. You see that they're reducing and destroying buildings along the perimeter of Gaza in order to create this kilometer-long buffer zone, basically. So they're actively putting into place other phases, other parts of their campaign, even as they are now shifting south, because now they've got Khan Yunis surrounded. They're advancing into Khan Yunis. They're destroying the hospitals. And then, of course, other infrastructure in Khan Yunis. They're telling the public you have to leave and you have to go towards the coast or continue to go towards Rafah. There's just no room for the people, as well as the Israelis attack and kill them there as well. And all of it is, by what metric are we saying it's been reduced? Because the Israelis are still killing 200 Gazans a day. So technically, I guess that's less of a number than they were killing a month ago or 2 months ago, but still killing 200 civilians a day. About 80 of them children, I guess, probably, if about 40% being killed are children. So about 80 probably about children. So I think a lot of it is attempts by the media. In the U.S. media the U.S. corporate media has served a great role in aiding and abetting this genocide. And so I think it's attempts to try and show that things are winding down, take the pressure off of Israel, take the pressure off the White House, that this thing is simmering down. Look, Joe Biden talking, behind closed doors to Netanyahu, even though he's spoken to him like once in the last month. Also all these things belie and expose the lies of what we're being told about what's occurring here. It's working, I think we have to take the Israelis at their word. for what they're saying, that it will go on for a year. We have to understand the trajectory of history, what they want to accomplish, what they've been trying to accomplish. I think we have to recognize the opportunity that they have now to get it accomplished. I think many in Israel feel like we won't have another chance to do an ethnic cleansing like we're doing right now. We won't get this chance again. Now is the opportunity to do it. Yeah, I mean, I think we have to recognize that for what it's worth. And then also, too, their actions. They're still killing 200 civilians a day. You know, they're destroying the hospitals still. They just killed 20 people yesterday who were queued up for food. You know, their tank shot them. They attacked a UN shelter. I mean, they're, you know, and this is just the stuff we know about, which is limited because the internet lines keep going down. So we keep having these blackouts where we are getting some information, but we're certainly not getting all the information.
Matt, when it comes to the political system of Israel, they're talking about in the United States, they're always talking about that one of the few democracies in that region. When you look at Israel, you see the monopoly of Netanyahu and his party. And it seems to me that the presidents of the United States from both parties didn't do anything to solve that. Was there any sort of policy behind this kind of getting along with Likud party, or they didn't care about what's happening there and just get along with them?
I think it gets back to what we were saying before about for these people in the United States, members of Congress, people who staff the State Department and the Department of Defense, the NSC, and then certainly those at the White House, including the president and vice president, the means are the ends again. So what you've seen is that because we have this legalized bribery system in the United States, our democracy is so corrupted. Money rules. If you have an organization like the Israeli lobby, epitomized through AIPAC, although there are a number of different lobbying organizations, but just say AIPAC because it's simpler. This lobby then is able to control U.S. foreign policy with regards to Israel, because those who are in power want to stay in power. That's their only goal. That's their only motive. Everything else is so secondary, it doesn't count. They can say all they want about it. They can go to all the rallies. They can say they represent this constituency or that constituency. They can put forward releases about how they're introducing this bill that's going to bring about the Green New Deal, or it's going to, you know, allow cattle to graze on federal land, or whatever it is, their supposed thing. And, you know, but the reality is they want to stay in power. You know, they're so scared to death of the money that will go to them in an election campaign from the Israeli lobby going to an opponent. And you've seen that happen over and over again. And so ultimately for the White Houses, I mean, you've seen this in you know, going back to Donald Trump in, you know, in 2015, if you were to go back in time 8 years to about this time in 2016, Donald Trump was saying things, you know, plus or minus a couple months. Donald Trump was saying things about how he was going to settle the Israel-Palestine issue. I'm gonna, and he was doing the whole both sides thing. I'm gonna be even-handed. You know, I mean, I don't think he really knew what he was talking about. I wouldn't trust him, but he wasn't giving an Israel first line. He wasn't giving a line that was pushed by the Israeli lobby. And then he wins the nomination, and then his shift completely changes on Israel. You know, he sees he has this money coming in from the, you know, Jewish donors, and Sheldon Adelson, say, right, and his policy, his platform on Israel completely changes, and he's going to be the best friend the Israelis have ever had, right? And in the months that happens, goes from him saying, "I'm going to go over there, I'm going to be even-handed, I'm going to bang their heads together, make this work," you know, kind of thing. I'm going to get a deal, you know, whatever he described it, you know, in a way that was unlike what any other American contenders had said, with the exception of, say, maybe Bernie Sanders. And, you know, you had, you know, so you see how important that is, how decisive that can be. I live here in North Carolina, and there were, I think AIPAC brags about intervening in 15, I think it was 15 House races in 2022. Either 13 or 15 House races in 22. But the Israeli lobby brags about how they intervened in those races and made sure pro-Israel candidates won. 2 of those races were here in North Carolina. They spent, I think, about $30 million in those 13 or 14, however races there were, to make sure that their candidates won, that these pro-Israel candidates won. Some of it was very high profile, like Nina Turner in Ohio, who got beat by Shontel Brown. Others were much lower profile, but still very important, very decisive, like Erica Smith getting beaten by Don Davis, a pro-life Democrat here in North Carolina. You know, so you have these examples that are very real. And $30 million in 13 or 14 House races is a lot of money. And what happened in the weeks following Israel's attack on Gaza, following the October 7th attacks, of course, was AIPAC coming out and saying, we are going to spend $100 million to defeat these House candidates who have called for a ceasefire. And, you know, I mean, so now you do fortunately have 63, I think 63 members of the United States House, and about 4 members of the U.S. Senate who have said that who have called for a ceasefire, all of them Democrats. And will Israel go after all of them? No, but they'll go after some of them, and it will be decisive in some of those races, and they'll make examples out of them. And it's also, too, the calculation now is that some of these Democrats have come out so late into this, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The weight's already there. They're coming in, saying 4 months into this genocide that you're for a ceasefire is going to have no political power, has no you're putting no pressure, no leverage on anybody. You've already acquiesced for all these months, and now you're going to say this, that exerts no influence on the White House. So that fear that the lobby is going to intervene in your race, and say in the case of the White House's race, that the lobby would not support the Biden reelection campaign, put all its efforts behind the Republican, most likely Trump, but also, too, would support Bobby Kennedy. And also, as well, hey, if you want to have a no labels candidate, Joe Manchin, Liz Cheney, Joe Lieberman, Larry Hogan, I mean, I forget there's a couple others who are being touted as running on a no labels platform. Well, we're going to support them as well. And the only people who aren't going to get our support, President Biden, is you. You know, and so I think that dominates all of the White House's thinking on this. It's tactical, it's operational, it's strategic, and then it's political. You know, and the politics trumps everything. That's how you can have all these really stupid and dumb decisions made over and over, because the politics are what's important. And that's what they're counting on. It. And the White House thinks that that money from the lobby is more important than potentially losing a few million progressive votes because of this, right? That will support genocide. And yes, we will have people who won't vote for us, but that's not as important as having the Israeli lobby throw all their support behind, not just Donald Trump, but, Bobby Kennedy and potentially a Joe Manchin, Liz Cheney, no labels ticket, right? So I think and then you push that down and you see that all the way down to the state level, because we have that here on the state level as well, as well as on the local level. We have efforts all around the United States to try and get various counties and cities to adopt resolutions calling for ceasefires. And we have heard that again here from city council members, that they're afraid of getting involved in this, putting a name on a ceasefire resolution, because they're afraid that Israeli lobby money will come into their city council race. I mean, that's how pervasive this is. That's how dangerous this is. That's how, important this is. And I think that ultimately helps you understand why these decisions are made, because, it's just not the moral horror of what's occurring in Gaza. It's not just the violations of international law, but it's also too strategically unsound. How is what's happening in Gaza? How's what potentially will happen next in Palestine, in the West Bank? How is what could potentially happen in southern Lebanon, and on and on? How's what's happening? How is any of this helpful to the United States? How is any of this a benefit to the United States interests, let alone to the public? So I think understanding that this is all political, it always is, helps you understand why these decisions are made.